Hello and welcome to the Dank Christian Memes podcast. My name is Broclen. I'm one of the moderators for Dank Christian Memes along with Jacob over here. I'm also the digital minister and the host for this podcast, as you've probably guessed. Jacob, you want to give us a quick introduction as our resident archaeologist and co-host?
Yeah, so my name's Jacob, and I am a frequent co-host here. Sometimes an inconsistent one, but most of the time I'm here. Yeah, I have a background in Near Eastern archaeology, and I'm also a moderator on Dank Christian Memes. And Broclen and I have a lot of fun together with this community.
Yeah, I sometimes refer to you as my partner in crime, sometimes refer to you as my better half. Both of those things are true, I believe. Although I'm sorry if people think we're wedded together when I say that. Maybe I should be a little more careful. Anywho, let's start with our news. So I'll just do both the news items because I don't want to stick you with the bad one. So we'll start with the good news, and then we have bad news. The good news is our fundraiser is complete. The Dank Christian Memes fundraiser for St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital is completed. Our total is, hold on, let me get it up, make sure I'm looking at it right here, $25,716, which is more than double what we raised last year. So we've got a nice trend going here. We're glad we can help out St. Jude, and we're looking forward to next year. One of the big features of this year was that we had an expansion of partners, which you can see. There's links in the description. You can look at all our new partners, as well as special support from Reddit community funds who did donation matching for us. So that was really exciting. That's cool, and we're excited to try to carry that year over year and try to improve a little bit as we go each time. It's
been fun to watch those numbers come in because they get big real fast, and it's cool to see how many people care to help charities and whatnot.
Well, we love numbers go up, right? I think one of the lessons of the internet is we love to watch numbers go up in a meaningful way. And I think this is one of the best ways to enjoy number go up by making sure you're doing something good. And what I enjoy about St. Jude is they both take care of the patient in front of them who obviously needs care, but also are focused on long-term improvements of care and hopefully eventually cures, so that there's both a systemic and a personal approach. So that's been great, and I'm excited for next year. Now for the sad news, which we kind of already know, but it's official that Reddit Talk is no longer with us. This podcast is coming to you from the afterscape that we call Discord. So we're in a sense, our podcast is not a place, it's a people, I guess. Maybe that's the encouraging thing to say right now. But it's taken an exodus. It's taken an exodus to this new promised land is what's going on. Well, and this is where we are for now, and I'm, open to different ideas. There's a rumor that Reddit will try audio again. I'm not going to hold my breath, but I'll keep my eyes open. So, we'll see if that goes. But, we've been burned, but it's good to have flexibility that your podcast can thrive across multiple recording mechanisms, I guess.
Yeah.
What do you think, Jacob? Are you sad about the end of Reddit Talk, or is it just sort of a natural thing for Reddit to do at this point?
To be honest, I didn't notice it except that we had to move here. I wasn't listening to any others. So I feel like probably from Reddit's point of view, it probably was just something that was underutilized for its upkeep costs. And that's probably why it left. And as a user who didn't make much use of it beyond this, I'm not that surprised, frankly.
Yeah, no, it's not super surprising. I think there was talk of a third party who was instrumental and ceased to exist very suddenly. So that was why we, didn't get too much head talk. So this is going to be probably the last full episode of this season before we start season 2. But I have one more. I think I can pull together a bonus episode that's actually made from the Reddit Talk time. So I think for anyone who's a Reddit Talk enthusiast, we have one more little snippet for you to remember the good old days. So that'll be coming down the line probably in a few weeks.
Sounds good.
Should we get to our topic at hand? So let me start by pleading ignorance, and I think this is an important, humbling thing for me to do, is that I have heard things about creationism, but that doesn't mean I know things about creationism. And in fact, I know very little. What comes to mind for me is, that's a weird thing for Christians to get hung up on the first 2 chapters of Genesis. But I'm sure, as I'll come to learn, that's a gross oversimplification. So I'm going to try to keep my prejudices aside, because they probably are just that. They're not educated. They're just kind of ideas and biases that I have. What is your level of interaction with creationism, or maybe that zone of Christianity? I'm not sure how to refer to it here.
So I guess I'll start with the disclaimer, because anyone who clicks on the creationist title is probably going to have one of 2 intentions here. It's either this is going to be a fascinating rabbit hole to learn about the truth of the creation in 6 days, or there's the alternate person clicking who's like, I'm going to tear this down because these people are silly. For full disclosure, I am no longer a creationist in the term that creationists use generally to refer to themselves. I should put a disclaimer here that when we talk about creationism as a body of information or of ideas, we're not talking about the idea that there is a creator God in general. Usually it refers to the idea that there was an instantaneous creation of the world in a form generally similar to the way it exists today. So it is an explicit rejection of long-term naturalistic processes leading to that.
So it's one thing to believe in a creator God, as many Christians and maybe many people from Abrahamic religions in general believe, and to believe in this very specific, what might be called literal interpretation of the sort of creation narratives. Is that right?
Right. And so when we're talking about my level of interaction, I used to be someone who very ardently argued for what is called in creationist circles creation science, which is the essentially body of polemics that exist that attempt to frame in scientific terminology apologetics arguing for creationism. I was this way for years, and then I sort of fell out of that because, spoiler alert, the deeper you get into topics like archaeology and paleontology, the more untenable those ideas tend to become.
But you were part of a community that held this as, I'm guessing, one of the pillars or cornerstones of their faith, right? That it's not just that they believe this, but that they believe this is important.
I would say, so the relationship to community there is an interesting one. My church as a kid was definitely mixed on this point, and it wasn't that important to them. But I consumed media and had a lot of interest in ancient history and in biology. That meant that to reconcile my interest with my general fundamentalist surroundings, I had to take a stance on this in order to sort of flesh out. I don't know how to phrase it exactly. In order to reconcile the fact that books I was reading would often contradict a literalist reading of the Bible, simply because, well, if you're discussing evolution and whatnot, there's a certain crowd out there who is also reading Genesis along with you who's like, that doesn't work together.
So here's my question. Because I think that the evolution discussion is a little better known, but would we be making a mistake to assume that those who are opposed to the concept of evolution are necessarily creationists or maybe young Earth creationists? I'm imagining that there's a Venn diagram, but that they are not all in all the same group.
There is. So creationism is actually an incredibly broad descriptor. What I'm mostly referring to here is young Earth creationism. Young Earth creationism is the explicit idea that the Earth is generally only a few thousand years old. For most apologetic groups, such as Answers in Genesis, they argue it's about 6,000. This is following the chronology of Archbishop James Ussher, who famously tried to set dates to various events in the biblical record. And there are others. There's also Old Earth creationism, which is kind of a point that tends to get absorbed by one or the other because it sort of has...
I've never heard of Old Earth creationism. That's new to me.
Old Earth creationism basically argues that like things like naturalistic processes of creation didn't occur so much as God, in various points throughout a very long period of time, initiated momentary creation. So basically an Old Earth creationist would be someone who said that, like, maybe the universe is 14 billion years old and the Earth is 4.6 billion years old, but at some point, since we know that God created the Earth, they would argue, then he must have made the Earth just appear at some point. It's that sort of thing.
Well, and I imagine this to be sort of... We've talked about this a number of different ways, that there's a distance between the theology of the pulpit or of the seminary school and theology of the pews. And then I think for a lot of people, imagining God saying, "Let there be light," in the beginning of the Big Bang, I think there are a lot of Christians or Christian adjacent people who say, "Yeah, sure, that makes perfect sense. Good enough for," and that's probably about the end of it. I think that sort of... I'm tempted to use the word syncretistic, but I think that there are a lot of Christians that are very comfortable with that. And I almost get the impression that this is almost a counter response to a level of acceptance between religion and science, which isn't new. And we've seen, especially in the Catholic Church, for, I'll just say, a good long time.
Yeah, I think also there's the fact is that most of the times when you encounter interviews that show like creationism is a massive force in America or whatever, they're not necessarily critical of the facts on the ground, which is that most people don't have a strong dog in the game, right? Like, or a dog in the ring. I don't know. I guess I'm using dog fighting as a comparator here. Probably a bad one.
A dog in the race, although that's dog racing is also pretty bad.
True,
but what's your level of investment in this issue? And I think for a lot of Christians, it's not high.
Right. It's essentially nothing for most. It impacts most people's personal faith very little. And so when you see these polls that are like, do you believe in evolution or do you believe in instantaneous creation by God, or are you not sure? Most people who answer those, if you ask a similar level that assesses their level of confidence, it will be very low, because, most people throughout their day don't really think about, evolution or the creative processes of God. Like they're both very distant.
It doesn't feel like this is where the deep exegetical time should be spent, and that's me just kind of falling back on my original knee-jerk reaction, where I'm like, we've got so much interesting stuff that just happens in Genesis alone, but different people look at Scripture and find different sources of inspiration. So, like, I want to be, even though I don't understand it, I still want to be fair to it, because I know, I'm a seminary student. I've definitely found this piece of Scripture that I'm just super jazzed about. So, like, I guess I don't want to take that away from anybody.
Right. I'll use as an example here the line of argument that's generally used by Answers in Genesis, which is essentially the world's largest creationist outreach organization. It's the one that has the museum in Kentucky, and is run by Ken Ham, who famously debated Bill Nye way back in the day, if you remembered that. Generally, the argument they make on why it's such an important issue is that the role of God as creator in Genesis is considered to be so important to the foundational understanding of the rest of the Bible that if it's undercut, everything falls apart. They like to point to the fact that
I feel like everything falls apart for them.
Right. I mean, this isn't an issue for most people, but this is a specific mindset here. They like to point to things in like the letters of Paul where Jesus is referred to as the second Adam, and they'll say things along the lines of, if there wasn't a literal first person Adam, then the theology of Christ's importance is diminished. And I don't tend to agree with this any longer, and I know you don't, but if we run with this idea for a little longer as a concept, you can see why there would be a lot of investment in creating polemics that hold up an argumentative reason for a literal taking of the Genesis scripture. And when I say literal, I should also put an asterisk there, because it requires some interpretation to make literal, since there are two creation stories.
How do we count a day before certain celestial bodies have been formed? Little details like that.
Yeah. So when I say literal, it's still being interpreted, but the idea by those doing that interpretation is that they are reading it as is. So what emerges from this is the field I mentioned earlier, creation science, which is an attempt to frame in scientific terms these polemics. And the idea is that traditional theology only really goes so far, because today the sort of, when people are talking about evolution or the age of the earth or whatever, they're not engaging with that field. They're engaging with radiometric dating, with paleontology, with geology, with astronomy. And the idea is to jump in the ring where these ideas are being propagated, and to essentially try to fight them at the source.
Is this a form of evangelism? Like, not just that we understand what creation is and why it's so important, but that we must make believers of all nations, sort of? Or is it just sort of making sure to carve out a place for their position, but not necessarily a desire to dominate? Is this an evangelical effort, or is it something different?
It is. Most of these ministries that carry this out frame it as a sort of outreach methodology. The thing is, it rarely actually works that way. If you look at statistics, it tends to, especially nowadays, the number and so most of the efforts that you see nowadays, rather than continuing to outreach in effect, will instead focus their efforts on sort of hemming in, fencing in the flock that would otherwise run away.
So I have a question at this point about sort of the identity, because we're talking about creationism almost like it's a denomination, and it's not. Are there certain denominations that are associated? And is this a sort of non-denominational or post-denominational phenomenon, or are there like a group of usual suspects that we might expect?
I would say it's trans-denominational. When I talk about Answers in Genesis, they are an explicitly American Protestant organization. They have criticisms of Catholicism. They basically see Mormons as heretics. Like they have a certain slant to them, but the ideas themselves cross over, and I wouldn't even say they're limited to Christianity. Plenty of the polemics that come up with creation science, you will see also on like Islamic blog posts and stuff. They'll get used by Jewish groups. There is an entirely separate world of Hindu and Buddhist creationism that is not based on Abrahamic narratives whatsoever.
Should we consider this almost like an interfaith movement, or is no one actually shaking hands? They just sort of have this notion in common.
I would compare it to the fact that like conspiracy theorists' ideas can cross between groups very well. You have a bunch of people who are interested in the same topics and who have the same fights, and they will never stand back to back. The Christian and Muslim creationists are almost across the board fundamentalists, and they see the others as, essentially doomed. But they both have useful polemics, so you can watch the arguments between the two cross over because they have very similar end goals that they're working towards, and they have a sort of competitive symbiosis, I suppose, a symbiosis of convenience.
It's really interesting the way that plays out, though, like the sort of spectrum of belief where, on a certain issue, you might actually be on the same side with someone where on almost every other issue, you would never consider that you'd have anything in common.
Right. There's even, like we mentioned, the Catholic Church. The official teaching of the Catholic Church might be that there is nothing in evolutionary science that contradicts, the Bible message. But there are plenty of individual creationist Catholics in very large numbers that participate in this same ecosystem. So I would say that, well, creationist media in the United States specifically is overwhelmingly evangelical Protestant. The actual consumers of it by primary or secondary means are far more diverse than that. I know that the Mormon Church in particular takes no official stance on evolution. I looked at their website at one point and they stated something along the lines of that it's an issue of science that goes beyond theology as a way to sort of dodge the question. But if you look at online at polemics by individual Mormons, you'll see that it's a very, very common idea for them to take creationist talking points in the first place and use them. And so, there is this dynamic.
Do creationists tend to be on the conservative side of the fence? Do we have more centrist, moderate, or sort of liberal Christians, for lack of a better term, also taking up these fights, or do they exist as part of a larger culture war?
It's a culture war thing. When we talk about, so this is a thing that comes up when you talk about the history of creationism as told by creationists versus non-creationists. Creationists love to argue that the creationist movement is sort of, for lack of a better term, indigenous to Christianity, that it goes back all the way within Christianity, and they'll point to figures like Newton and others that lived before evolutionary ideas became common. Arguably, there's evolutionary talk all the way back in the Arab Golden Age from figures like Al-Jahiz, but they like to claim them because it strengthens this argument that this is the historical mode of Christianity. But generally, a sociological.
Well, that's kind of a fallacy, right? I can claim that, everyone before Thomas Edison didn't believe in electricity.
Right,
and
it's also historically problematic. Augustine already argues for an allegorical reading of the days of Genesis in the waning days of the Western Roman Empire. It's clear that it wasn't an issue in the same way that it is today. So that's why an outside commentator on creationism will usually look at it as a movement stemming from American neo-evangelicalism, that basically responded to the idea that secular society was a corrupting force, or I should say fundamentalism, not neo-evangelicalism, the fundamentalist movement that neo-evangelicalism rebelled from. It's this idea that modern society has a secularizing agenda, that it is invading especially our classrooms. If you ever want a deep dive that we probably don't have time to get into, but it's one of my favorite topics in American history, the Scopes monkey trial in the interwar period.
That sounds like a season 2 episode for sure.
Oh, well,
we should definitely hit that up.
Happily cover this in its entirety. Basically, there is a trial. I believe it's in the state of Tennessee. I might need to check that, but
My knowledge of it is limited, but I know it was the beginning of a much larger culture war around exactly this kind of issue. They were focused on the sort of I couldn't even tell you what the core question of the case was, but it is the starting point from our current debate. And like you said, it established, well, they're going to teach you science, and that their science is contrary to the Bible's science, or what have you. And this all feels I feel like most people who are tuned into political media are sort of used to the culture war by now. So whereas maybe it was a little more subtle, but there is a sort of idea of, I don't want to say warring agendas, but like I said, it is an evangelical movement, and they're trying to at least carve out a spot for themselves, if not, demonstrate that they've got it right, which, I guess every religious group tries to do, myself included. Obviously, I'm going to tell you my particular beliefs are right. So like I said, I don't want to be a hater, but also, it's just a place that I can't theologically feel compelled enough to take up an embattled position. I guess I'm just not invested enough theologically. I guess you can make of that what you will, whatever that might say about me.
Right. To loop back to the monkey trial a bit, the Scopes trial. It should be noted that it actually was a trial that the teacher of science, who was put there, by the way, specifically to bait this trial to create a public show, did lose. He was actually going against the state's laws, which restricted the teaching of evolution altogether. But the idea was to make a show of it, the fact that these laws existed specifically to create a sort of protection against this idea that that basically the introduction of the idea that humans were apes would lead to a moral decline. And that was what was argued by actually a 3-time Democratic presidential candidate on the other side of the debate, William Jennings Bryan. You might have heard of him if you ever learned about Theodore Roosevelt as a significant political rival of his. He basically argued
it's all very familiar, though, that I feel like this was new at the time, but now passing laws about what can or can't be taught in a particular state is a fast track to the national news.
Oh yeah, it was so
it proved the concept.
Yeah.
So others could take advantage of it to this day. So you got to respect the game on some level, I guess.
And that's what's still going on. If you read creationist polemics on their websites and whatnot, it's very often focused on this idea that the danger is in our schools, that the people teaching kids today are going to teach them ideas that will take them away from whatever traditional values parents put upon them. It feeds on this anxiety, and it's the same anxiety that crosses over with all sorts of other culture war topics. And so, at the end of the day, there's a sort of multilateral dynamic that goes into why creationism exists and thrives as a or I shouldn't say thrives. It is very much declining, but it exists at a large scale and as an industry, is because of these sort of multiple tracks. There's the track that is the culture war anxiety. There's the track that is probably people who are genuinely interested in science. I think that I always find it's a bit of a pet peeve when I see people who say that creationists are anti-science, and certainly they don't generally understand scientific methodologies very well, and they usually don't employ them. But there is genuine interest that brings people there. People don't create entire blogs about flood geology because they're not interested in geology in any degree. They're very much looking at the Earth on some level and trying to interpret it. And so I feel like it sort of misses the point, which is that the people who are appealed to by creation science polemics are not always the culture warriors. Sometimes the fringe science lovers who simply don't distinguish between what is carried out in an academic proper way and what is carried out in a way that has a sort of agenda to it, right?
Well, that was going to be my question, is that to what extent is this a matter of evidence? Is this an epistemological problem that we see repeated in many other issues, where one party accepts something as evidence and the other party does not?
It is that. If you are a young Earth creationist, there are a lot of threats that exist in general understandings of like science and whatnot. One of the big ones that they go back to a lot, and so I'm going to use it as sort of an easy example here, is radiometric dating. We have a very good understanding of how radiometric dating works. Basically, if you're not familiar...
You have a good understanding of how radiometric dating works.
Okay, so certain isotopes, those are variations of an atom based on numbers of neutrons. Certain isotopes are unstable. And various elements have different stable and unstable isotopes. And these unstable ones will break down to a different isotope of the same element or a different element altogether. And
so based on their decay of isotopes and what they turn into, we have an idea of how old certain essential stuff is, right?
Yeah, every radioactive isotope has a measurable decay rate where you can measure the rate at which it will decay into what it's called its daughter material. You have parent and daughter materials, because this is fairly consistent. Even though there are, to put an asterisk there are openings for things like contamination and whatnot. Scientists who participate in this go to great efforts to try to minimize those and ensure that they have good, high-quality samples, but that's a whole other discussion. Because this is fairly well established, it creates a problem, which is that for things like carbon dating and potassium-argon dating, etc., there are plenty of biological and geological materials that will turn out dates that are considerably older than young Earth creationists accept for the world. And because of that, there is a lot of literature out there that creationists have produced that seeks to undermine the idea of radiometric dating altogether, because it is a potentially fatal issue, frankly. And so they'll like to point to times where there's been messes up or contamination or whatever to suggest that the option is very arbitrary. There is an alternative version, if you want the really wacky, that will basically argue that during the Great Flood, something wacky happened with physics.
Oh boy, the fringe of the fringe here.
And basically all of the radiometric decay occurred at the same time. And so...
what was in that water? Godsend. Jeez.
If you want a very wacky rabbit hole to go down, you can look up the heat problem, which which will take too much time to explain, but it is a very fun physics discussion where creationists try to solve the heat problem, which is the fact that supposedly if all of this decay occurred at once, so much heat must have been released that it would have vaporized the crust of the Earth.
You gotta watch out for that.
This is out there. There's almost any field you go into that deals with things like astronomy, geology, archaeology, paleontology. There's a polemic somewhere on there, and I actually am a little salty. The archaeology ones are light, and so I have less fun reading to do because they don't tend to deal with much that isn't ancient Egypt. So if you're a creationist content creator listening, please give me more to read where you try weird archaeology stuff because I need it. But
it's true. Our culture does thrive on polarization. You need to find your opposite pole, and that's the match made in heaven. Apparently, can make both your parties happy by making each other miserable.
I mean, to be honest, it'll probably just make me mad. But like, it's funny because the Ancient Aliens guys and the like Graham Hancock and friends, they have so much where they like try to overturn our understanding of archaeology. And for some reason, the creationists just don't as much, even though they 100% disagree with it. And I've never understood why this is.
So I had a professor in college for undergrad. I had to take all sorts of things. So I took I think it was an archaeology 101. It was an archaeology for the mildly interested sophomore or whatever. And my professor was actually this really cool guy who was like the talking head who argued against the alien guy sort of indirectly in a few of the, quote unquote documentaries about ancient aliens. Mm-hmm. And he was always super snarky, which made his classes really fun. But it's also like, so, you know me, I try to make Dank Christian memes a place for, if not everyone, as many people as possible.
Right.
And I get to a point where I'm kind of snarky. I've admitted I can be judgmental. So how do we interact with ideas that it's hard not to find absurd without being insulting to others, which, whether or not you're concerned about being insulting, that just makes them even more entrenched in their position. So I would argue that being insulting against someone you dislike, even though I do it sometimes, is not an effective strategy. How do we walk this line, or what is your view on walking this line? Because I know you've been pulled in many different directions at many different times of respecting someone where, I think their position is a little wacky,
right.
and or perhaps a bit, beside this point, theologically speaking. I want to respect folks, but it's hard to respect the position they occupy.
I think so. Here's what I would suggest with pseudoscience topics in general. My belief is that if you're not earnestly trying to change them or change this discourse that exists, then you could easily fall into the trap of vengeful responses. I think a lot of the times when you see online discourse where people believe in pseudoscience, the overwhelming argument you'll see from people is like, cut them out of your life, because a certain group of skeptics is, so angry at the presence of these ideas that the only conceivable way to get away from them is to eliminate our connection from them. And this is absolutely
that sounds a bit
not counterproductive.
Extreme.
Yeah, but it's
right.
It's,
well, I mean,
it's the advice you'll see online, unfortunately.
Unless their belief in young Earth creationism is resulting in an abusive pattern in your family, which I don't, as much as I don't really care for the theology, I don't see it pointing in that direction. So
right. At the end of the day, most people who hold these views are very benign. The views are more dangerous in the sense that they encourage a poor understanding of science that feeds directly into other pseudosciences such as climate change denial, anti-vaxxers, etc. There's strong statistical evidence that shows that the people who are in these various camps cross over incredibly heavily and as a pattern.
That was going to be one of my questions. First of all, I wonder if we should do an episode on conspiracy theories and how they compare to folklore. But also this, how much overlap is there with conspiracy theories, which I know for a lot of atheists, Christianity in general, they consider it to be a conspiracy theory. Mm-hmm. So it's a bit of a loaded term to throw around, but do you feel like there's another Venn diagram, or are we looking at closer to a single circle.
Yeah, I think, frankly, they're very closely aligned with one another. Even though I said earlier that a lot of these people do have a genuine interest in science, generally the culture of it is critical of the establishment in a way that causes them to see any, for lack of a better term, mainstream discussion of science to be fundamentally part of a plot, especially if it suggests any sort of social or ideological adjustment is needed on the part of society.
And it's that plot part that really does, because, it's one thing to think, our schools are kind of crummy. They might not be doing good things. And to say that, well, there's a group of people making sure our schools are crummy and doing bad things. But it does seem like those two positions are really adjacent to each other and easy to cross lines. Right.
And I'll say this also as someone who does substitute teaching and is often in school environments. Your schools are not effectively indoctrinating your children into anything. The kids
I also
don't care
work in a
about half of
school.
what we say. Like,
I find the idea that public schools are effective to be offensive.
Like, the fact is, like, we could barely regulate what kids, how kids bully each other. Like, at the end of the day, nobody is changing your kids' religious beliefs at school. They talk about them in class all the time. We don't stop them at all. That's not a thing.
Well, and I feel like this issue with schools, especially public schools, is not a conspiracy theory itself, but like the connecting tissue between multiple conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
So this has me convinced that we do need to do a conspiracy theory episode. But when it comes to creationism, okay, I want to get to some. We've talked about a lot of things that are silly, but this is the only part that kind of makes me care. Do most creationists believe that dinosaurs are a conspiracy of Satan to convince us that they're real, or are creationists like, oh yeah, well, there were dinosaurs in the Garden of Eden? Like, what? And this is the polarizing issue for me. I don't care what your theology is. Do you like dinosaurs or not? And I guess I haven't changed since second grade in that way. So what is the position on dinosaurs in these communities? Does it vary?
Right. So you've hit on my favorite factionalist issue. So most creationists believe in dinosaurs. This is frankly just how it is.
Thank God. There's hope for interfaith dialogue after all.
If you go to sites like Answers in Genesis, they love dinosaurs a lot. They tend to argue that dinosaurs lived alongside humans before the flood and after the flood. They contend that dinosaurs were on the ark, which is very fun.
God, just make a movie about it.
If you think about how much
make a
food
movie about it. That sounds awesome.
Means, the food problem on the ark is substantial. However, they love to argue that the dragon myths come from garbled cultural memories of dinosaurs. They argue that the behemoth in the Bible is a sauropod, and that the Leviathan is usually either a mosasaur or some large plesiosaur. But basically, there is this other sub-faction that exists that you'll see on groups such as CAD, Christians Against Dinosaurs, that basically argues that dinosaurs and paleontology in general are conspiracy theories to create older organisms that would suggest evolution. And what's funny about this mindset is it basically suggests that the evidence is too good, therefore it must be made up. But this group is absolutely a pain in the butt to the sort of quote unquote mainstream creationists. Because it undermines a bunch of their talking points, and they tend to hate it. And it's really fun to see the back and forth here.
So is the group, the anti-dinosaur group, are they the fringe, or like what would you estimate their market share? Not that I'm, going to launch an attack on them or anything. Just curious how many you think there are.
I mean, probably millions, but like we're talking about societies of hundreds of millions. So they are the minority millions among larger millions. I think that like it's once again a thing of investment. Not very many people are invested in creation versus evolution. A smaller number are people who are invested in creation, but who have also investment in the issue of dinosaurs. I remember seeing, to jump to the Islamic creationism discussion, I remember seeing an argument by some mufti that was basically along the lines of, if you're splitting the ummah, the Islamic community, over the issue of dinosaurs, you're wasting your time. So like, a lot of religious leaders don't care about dinosaurs. That's just kind of, I mean, everyone thinks dinosaurs are cool, except the dinosaur deniers, I hope. Otherwise, their opinions are simply wrong. However,
well, the dinosaur deniers think dinosaurs are too cool, and that's partially why they can't have possibly existed, right?
It's something along. It tends to vary, but like the idea is that they're just unbelievable. I've seen images that one of my favorites that I came across was this discussion on Stegosaurus and how it was ridiculous that such an animal could have had sex. And
it's a ridiculous question to bring up. That's true.
Porcupines manage it. It's such a funny polemic that these things are out there. The things they think of. It's great. And for the record, since the discovery of the Psittacosaurus cloaca that was partly fossilized, we do have something of an understanding of dinosaur sexual biology now. And it probably worked very similarly to like birds and crocodiles. But yeah.
Thank goodness. Now I can rest knowing that science has answered this question for me. Thank you, Jacob.
But I would still caution against, if you ever find yourself in a creationist space, assuming that most of them are dinosaur deniers, because they almost certainly won't be. The largest outreach groups are all fairly quote pro-dinosaur unquote, and that's
common ground. That's cause for hope in my book. That we can at least enjoy the fact that dinosaurs are a thing. However the details might differ between us.
Although, if you get any publications by Answers in Genesis or whatever, you'll notice that if you're a dinosaur nerd like me, you'll notice that their dinosaurs are sort of stuck in about the 1980s. The newer dinosaurs are way too bird-like for their comfort zone. They have, despite feather impressions and fossils and everything, there's plenty of articles on their website that will argue that
they don't like it bumping up against evolution, basically, right?
It's too good because there's the problem that birds are physiologically and diagnostically zoologically dinosaurs, right? All of the features that define a bird are features that exist in dinosaurs.
I'm told.
And so any depiction of non-avian dinosaurs that gets too close to this understanding and portrayal is threatening to a certain interest. And so basically any book you'll find by creationist publishers on dinosaurs will have them decidedly a few decades out of date so that they don't look too bird-like to an audience who is not going to, read about feathered dinosaur fossils.
So as someone who's been, a part of the community, interacting with the community, generally we see the statistics that Christianity is in decline, and generally most groups are declining proportionally to what their original size was. Do you feel like this group has a future, that they've carved out a unique niche that has popular awareness that will, keep them afloat? Or do you think that they're declining with the rest, and perhaps this will just be another odd footnote in Christian arguments.
They're declining faster than the rest.
Are they relying heavily on older populations?
Yeah, when the current old generations die off, there's just going to be way less creationists.
And that is true for many groups and many denominations, some more than others. But, it is older baby boomers and sometimes older even than that are holding the church up. And when they eventually pass on, it's not clear how much of the church is still going to be holding up.
Right.
And
I think one of the reasons...
the big C church, not, any particular church. Sorry.
One of the reasons that there's this sort of moral panic about children and children's education is the fact that older generations are acutely aware that younger generations reject a lot of ideas that used to be mainstream for them. And this is the same dynamic here. If you grew up in a circumstance where sort of young Earth creationism was a mainstream or acceptable viewpoint, and you're encountering kids who consider it ridiculous because they learned about evolution in their biology class in high school, this issue is recognized. That's why the websites have blog posts that will be like, we need to reach out to our youth. That's why they create dinosaur books and other science media that sort of argue that like there's a that argue for this in a way that appeals to the interests kids have, because
it's all about marketing. If you can't market your ideas, they're not going to go anywhere.
Yeah, the people who are profiting off of it know what's going on. They know they're losing the fight, and they know where the problem lies. And that's
they're kind of stuck with that position.
Right.
I feel so. It sounds like their notoriety is to their detriment and not to their benefit. That this is for many people a settled issue, and there aren't many people to win towards the cause, unless perhaps it's connected to other things, and that's something I want to talk about is our whether we consider something to be a conspiracy theory or pseudoscience. To what extent is that informed or interacting with theology? And in this situation, very heavily. It's because of Genesis that these folks have these beliefs. So I'd be excited to explore that in a future episode with you if you're interested in that.
I would absolutely love to dive into this topic further. It's even since my views have changed, it's been one of my favorite things to read about forever. Because it's just, I don't know, it's like an ecosystem that exists out there, and most people don't see it. That's the thing, is if you are in a creationist circle, you think that you are on the front lines of a culture war that is gripping the entire nation. If you are far away from that circle, you probably don't notice that there's like a lot of people who think that. Like, it's actually fairly invisible. They tend to overestimate their own reach. And because of that, there's a very different perception of what's going on in the world. And creationists will be like, we should have an equal position in representation and things like education and the sciences, etc. And then you look at the statistics and you realize that the amount of scientists who hold to it are very often next to null. The amount of educators who hold to it are considerably smaller. The population that holds to it in any strong degree, in any degree where they can actually talk about it, is significantly lower than people who can educatedly talk about evolution. And so it's sort of it's this false balance that creationists believe they have, that is actively cultivated by the people who are sort of leading the ministries and profiting off of it. Because if they lose that illusion, they'll have people realize I'm the weird one in society, right? And that's an uncomfortable thing.
And we see these sort of weird, I almost call them nihilistic ministries, when, where the person participating in the ministry would say, well, I'm right because look how mad they are. I'm right because the world is worldly and look how much I offend the world. And people from the Westboro Baptist Church have done that, and all sorts of, basically claiming I'm right because of the scandal I've created, and the scandal I create is for God, therefore it's a righteous scandal.
Mm-hmm. I think that there's I hesitate to project that on everyone. I do think there are plenty of well-meaning creationists, and so I don't particularly want to say that they are malicious in that way necessarily all the time. There are definitely ones out there who are. And there's definitely very public polemicists that have that exact mindset.
I think we can agree that this position, even though I don't agree with it, like you said, it's mostly benign. It's mostly harmless. I think what I'd like to explore in a future episode, or maybe a few future episodes, is to what extent this and other theological ideas cross over. And where do they take us? Because I feel like when it's benign, and the biggest issue we're debating is, well, what's your position on dinosaurs? Because that's what I really care about. that it's not so bad. But when this is packaged with other ideas, and that's sort of what denominations do, right? They package ideas and right. theologies together, then things become a little more complicated. So I want to get into that. I think there's a few different ways that we could, but I think it's important for us to recognize, like you said, that this one is okay by itself. It may be weird. It's certainly not helping education on certain issues, but we're not aware of anyone committing acts of violence or harassing anyone, or it's as quirky as it may be, it seems generally harmless, and hopefully it stays that way, and we can just talk about dinosaurs. But like I said, I want to make sure we make a distinction between things that are problematic, like the Westboro Baptist Church, which I feel like everyone knows that at this point. So just wanted to be clear on that.
What's problematic to me is not individuals who hold these ideas. What's problematic to me is the symbiosis they have with pseudoscience as a wider public phenomenon. Like I said before, there's strong correlation with people who hold these views and those who hold views against vaccination, against the idea that humans have any impact on the climate, or that it matters. I mean, one argument I've seen from people who basically believe the Earth is young and going to end soon, because a lot of end times thought tends to go into this as well. Basically argued
apocalyptic thinking.
Yeah, that the Earth is a transitory gift to humanity that we can use up because it doesn't matter in the long run. That's an idea that exists out there, and I've seen. That
also sounds pretty nihilistic to me.
In a way, yeah. I think that the larger issue here is what it feeds into. It's a rhetoric that becomes a part of other things. At the end of the day, someone approaching you on the street and saying, "Did you know that the sun was created on day 4?" That's not going to ruin your day. But if someone consumes the content that tells them that there's a conspiracy to indoctrinate children, that it goes on all these deep levels, that it might go further in other places, that, at that point you start to see the beginnings of a worldview that enables and encourages a toxic defensiveness towards a wide variety of other things.
Yeah, and I think we see a lot of overlap with that, and a lot of, for lack of a better term, culture war items. thank you very much. We're coming up to the end of the time. I feel like we've had a pretty round discussion on the topic. Is there anything we missed or anything you want to throw out there as we wrap up?
I'll just throw out there, because any topic I bring up will be another monologue. I'll just throw out there that if we revisit this topic again, I would be very excited to jump into like any sort of science discussion or theological discussion on the topic further down the line.
This sounds great. Like I said, this is going to be our last full episode of season 1. Hoping to get a bonus episode in there, and hopefully we can be working on season 2 before too long. But we've already got some good ideas that we just talked about here already. So I feel like we're pretty good. Anything else I should cover before I read our show notes?
I think you're good.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for everyone who's in our audience. I wasn't expecting to have an audience today, so thanks a lot. This has been the Dank Christian Memes podcast. Dank Christian Memes is a place for all kinds of Christians and all kinds of non-Christians to enjoy memes and fellowship. If you'd like to connect with our community further, we have social links in the description. Our music is provided by Olive Tiger. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, may the memes bless you and keep you.